Welcome to Medieval India. Episode 18, the Mughal economy. The Diwan, the revenue administration of the Mughal Empire, was concerned primarily with the assessment and collection of the land revenue. The traditional third of the gross produce of the soil that, as we saw, had already been fixed by Alauddin Khalji, but in some provinces, if not in all, it also dealt with customs, the salt tax, and a few other items. The bulk of the revenue was assigned to officers of the state service, but certain areas were reserved for the imperial treasury, and the work of the Diwan thus fell apart into two main divisions. The management of the reserved crown areas, called Halsa, since the day of the Sultanate, and the allocation of assignments, or Jakir, which word in the days of the Sayyid dynasty had replaced the Ikta, which I discussed in episode 3. The difference being that a Jakir was an assignment to a person that was in principle revocable and tied to a function. For that purpose, the Diwan had a commissioner in each province, taking orders directly from him and independent of the Subadar. And he had a staff of collectors whose main duties were to assess and collect the revenue of their circle, but who also acted as governors for the purpose of the general administration. Allocation of assignments was done at the headquarters of the Diwan, but not by the local staff. Each officer was, it may be said, in the position of a tax collector within the area assigned to him, but as a rule he appointed a representative to live on the spot, and this representative acted as governor for the area in his charge. As regards the assessment of the revenue, it is obvious that to weigh and divide the produce of the land, field by field, season by season, of an area many times that of France, with 6 times its population, was not a practical proposition. There were two schools of opinion, one of which favored assessment by simplified methods of the sum payable by each peasant, while the other school preferred to assess a lump sum on the village as a whole, leaving the peasants to calculate among them the share due from each of them. What the British, who studied those earlier debates closely, would later on call the Rayatwari and the Mahalwari system. The Mahalwari system was obviously the simpler one, but it was open to the objection that with the very unequal distribution of land in the villages, the stronger peasants might then be tempted to oppress the weaker ones. In Akbar's eyes, this objection was conclusive, and he decided on the alternative of individual assessment. To begin with, he worked with the system that had been introduced by Sher Shah, who apparently had taken the same view. But after a short time, that system proved unworkable, and a period of experiments followed, resulting in the evolution of an alternative which was held to be workable and substantially just. Akbar, however, was not obsessed by the principle of administrative uniformity, and he allowed for local conditions. In the hill country and in Lower Sindh, in Bengal and in the provinces beyond the Narmada, he permitted the continuance of the practices already in force, even though they might conflict with the conclusions he had reached. And his distinctive system was confined to the plains of northern India, outside of Bengal. The essence of this system, which applied to Jaghir assignments as well as to the Khalsa reserved areas, was that each unit of an area sown was charged with a sum of money that varied with the crop. It was calculated to represent the average value of 1/3 of the produce. Each peasant thus knew, when he planned his season's croppings, what fiscal liability he was incurring. When the crops came up, measuring parties then went to work under the collector's supervision and ascertained the area of each crop sown by each peasant. The collector's clerks then calculated the sum due from each peasant at the rates in force, and this sum was collected at harvest with an allowance for any area on which the crop had failed to mature. The weak point in this system was that, while the peasant could tell beforehand what he would have to pay, he could not forecast the price his produce would yield, and owing to imperfect means of communication, prices fluctuated within very wide margins, both from market to market as from time to time. The peasant was reasonably well protected against bad harvest, for if his crops failed, he had nothing to pay. But if the local market was glutted, his produce might be almost unsaleable. This actually occurred between 1585 and 1590, when very large sums of revenue had to be written off because of a series of exceptionally good harvests that had left the country from Delhi to Allahabad overstocked with the produce, and the peasants could therefore not turn their crops into money. Besides assessing and realizing the revenue, collectors were required to further agricultural development too, designed to increase the amount of land under the plough, and they or their commissioners had wide discretionary powers to vary the system when necessary, so as to bring waste land into cultivation and increase the area sown with the most valuable crops. For these purposes, they could reduce the rates ordinarily charged, or they could also advance the capital required. Assuming an honest and efficient staff, this system made for the economic improvement of the empire. The collection of revenue was enforced by severe methods. Non-payment of revenue was deemed equivalent to rebellion. While eviction was not unknown as punishment, the more usual method seemed to have been imprisonment and torture of the village headman, followed by the massacre of the adult male population and the enslavement of women and children. Under Akbar, this system practically covered the entire region from the Indus to the Gagra. A major extension of it occurred in the later years of Shah Jahan's reign, when it was established in the Deccan by Murshid Quli Khan. Bengal stood apart from other provinces because the system enforced there was one known elsewhere as Muktai, a fixed demand. The revenue was levied in cash at rates per unit of land or in lump sums covering entire villages, the same amounts being levied year after year until, as a special measure, there might be a revision or enhancement. Awadh is interesting too, because the local tradition is emphatic that many of the Rajput chiefs maintained their authority practically intact throughout the Mughal period, and that they raised their own taxes. Thus the Bais Khan of Baiswara, famous for its powerful chiefs and the seat of Hindu orthodoxy of the Subah, or the Janwars of Bairampur, which can be traced back to the 14th century and endured into the 19th, and lastly the Bisan rulers of Gondar. From the official records, however, we might infer that the regulation system was enforced throughout every district of Awadh. The truth lies probably somewhere in between the two versions. In practice, the administration worked largely through such chiefs as just specified, who were permitted to retain a portion of what their peasants paid. Insofar as the rate per unit of area varied according to crop and not according to the size of the taxpayer's holding, it was a regressive tax falling more heavily on the smallholders. This was besides that the larger landholders might, as zamindars or headmen or members of a favored community, be required to pay less per unit of area, or might indeed altogether be exempt from tax, as being responsible for the local collection of the taxes. The fiscal burden thus rested disproportionately on the small cultivator, and must therefore have tended to intensify the already existing differentiation among the rural population. The collection in cash still further increased such differentiation. Those who had sufficient resources to raise cash crops would find it easier to pay the revenue upon selling the produce than did those smaller peasants who grew the coarser food grains, which at best had only a local market. Thus in Bayana district, for example, where the peasants grew indigo for the European market, the Dutch sources indicate a large and rapidly growing gap between big farmers and small farmers, where the big farmers not only set the price for the small ones growing indigo, but also constricted their access to the market and to the European purchasers, often by force. And the rebellious zamindars of that district were indeed a continuous headache to the empire, and would in the 18th century coalesce to form the Jat state of Bawalpur, as we shall see in the final episode of this series. As we have seen before, no man can be named as the author of this agrarian system, which rather gradually evolved from Qutb-ud-Din Aibak over Alauddin Khalji through to Sher Shah. For such portions of it as it evolved under the Mughals, Akbar was partly responsible, but the main credit for it is due to Raja Todar Mal, a Hindu belonging to one of the merchant castes, who began life as a clerk, rose to be the Mir Baksh, and for a long time became Akbar's Diwan. It is characteristic for Akbar's method too that on several occasions he sent Todar Mal, his financial expert, to command troops in the field, and his consistent success in these military operations would almost justify us in describing him as the best general of Akbar's reign. But as soon as each war was over, he came back to the Divan where his main work was done. His fame, with legendary accretions, would live on in the villages, and even in the British period he served as a standard of honesty and justice by which every British collector was judged by the peasants. However, he was by no means a perfect minister, being obstinate, bad-tempered and vindictive, and Akbar's treatment of him may fairly be described as a display of his talent for picking out administrative genius. His gifts were indispensable, but his faults could be avoided or corrected, and from time to time we find him not the sole minister, but associated with colleagues who could be trusted to keep him in check. Always a strict Hindu, in his old age he retired to die beside the Ganges. But Akbar called him back to duty, and he worked till his death. In regard to commerce, Akbar followed and extended Sher Shah's policy of making the roads safe, and he also abolished practically the whole mass of petty and vexatious imposts on trade which had prevailed in the old Hindu times and that had survived under the earlier Muslim rulers. He provided a serviceable, though not a perfect currency too. Under Alauddin, the treasure brought from the south had led to a period of high prices in northern India. But the plethora of coin had been absorbed before the end of the 14th century, and for a time gold and silver commanded a scarcity value and only copper remained in general circulation. When American silver then began to drift into India, with its imports by the Portuguese and by imports from the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf to settle the balance of payment deficit of the areas of the Ottoman Empire, silver became more widely available and cheaper, and Sher Shah was able to re-establish a silver currency. The coin which he introduced, and that became known as the rupee, has survived practically unchanged down to the present day. Under Akbar, while the rupee continued to be the standard coin, an extensive subsidiary coinage in both silver and copper was also issued. Coal too was coined, but did not become generally current, being quickly absorbed in hoards which Indian peasants tended to amass for times of scarcity, merchants for times of slack trade, and nobles for cases that property might be seized by the king and that all amassed to pay dowry, which in India then and now involves sums equal to a man's life's savings. The coins were artistically meritorious, but the technique of their production was still imperfect, being exclusively struck by hand, and it was easy to diminish their weight. The exchange rate between the different metals and between the different issues of a coin fluctuated. Where the coins struck in the current year of a ruler, the so-called Sikar coins or Sikar rupees, had a considerable premium, and there were dozens of different varieties in circulation, as well as often various local counterfeit coins struck by semi-independent chiefs. For these reasons, the merchants had still to employ the old established specialized money changers, the shroffs, in practically all their transactions. The shroffs were paid a percentage of the coins exchanged or assize. Several estimates have been made of the total revenue of the Mughal Empire, including the land revenue. Abul Fasl estimated Akbar's yearly revenue at 136,831 rupees. Abdul Hamid Lahori estimated the revenue of Shah Jahan's reign at 386,816,584 rupees in the first decade of his reign. But those annual sums still did not exhaust the total receipts of the Mughal emperors. It excluded all the presents received, tributes paid by feudatory princes of various grades, the savings represented by the employment of the contingent of princes, incomes from the tax on non-Muslims and the pilgrimage tax, judicial fines and fees, war indemnities paid by vanquished rulers, and savings in expenditure by deductions from the salaries of public servants and the employ of forced labor paid lower than the usual wage. The director of the Dutch East India Company, Johannes de Laat, noted that, quote, on the death of Akbar, his treasures were carefully counted and were found to amount in all, including gold, silver and copper, both wrought and unwrought, together with jewels and all the manner of household commodities, to 348 million rupees. Of this total, 200 million was in specie of all descriptions. This treasure included, besides fine porcelain, cloth of gold from Persia, Turkey, Gujarat and Europe, muslins from Bengal and wooden cloth from Europe, Persia and Tartary, that is Uzbekistan, also books written by great authors, beautifully bound to the number of 24,000, estimated at 7 million rupees value. This total brings us to the huge figure of 240 million sterling. Henry VII, who died in 1509, left 1,800,000 in bullion, and he was considered a rich king. Henry VIII debased the coinage, and Elizabeth left behind a debt of 400,000 sterling and huge numbers of false coins. The Mughal Empire was simply in a different financial league than any European state at the time, with the exception of Imperial Spain. With such incomes, the few hundred people at the top of the empire, while few in numbers, thus controlled the expenditures of a large proportion of the income of the country, and on their attitude depended the welfare of the classes by whom that income was produced. It has been estimated that in 1646 a mere 68 princes and nobles at the top claimed 5% of the entire income of the empire, and that the next 587 officials claimed nearly 25%. All the other mansabdars, together with their retinue, claimed between a third of the revenue, with the land revenue and other rural taxes accounting for the bulk of the surplus agricultural produce. The assignment of the larger portion of the empire in jagirs meant placing in the hands of a numerically very small class the control over much of the produce of the country. It therefore becomes important to bear in mind the characteristics of that class. The total number of those eligible to receive jagirs was no more than 8,000 in 1646. Only a small portion of the mansab holders belonged to the zamindar class, such as the Rajput, Baluch and Kakar chiefs. The very large majority consisted of immigrants, of Turanis, of Iranis and of Afghans, or, in rather small number, of recruits from the local intelligentsia and of petty local bureaucrats, the Shahzades, the Qadris, and so on. The mansab was not inheritable, though it was normally conferred upon sons or relatives of the higher mansabdars. That created whole families of noblemen or emirs who subsisted on mansabs from generation to generation. In as far as the Mughal mansabdars served the state as courtiers and functionaries, their economic role was that of a joint modern civil service and army command. But such a distinction between the Mughal state and its higher functionaries is somewhat artificial, since a major function of the state was to extract the surplus for distribution among the jagirdars and their imperial master. When some zamindars and rajas were drafted into the Mughals' service as mansabdars and at time had their own lands conferred on them as jagirs, the distinction between the Mughal officials and the social groups in the hereditary traditional control over lands and local political power was blurred too. Besides, hereditary or not, once Akbar's experiment to pay the mansabdars in cash failed, as a class the mansabdars and jagirdars together extracted the revenue which was distributed among them. Hence, while one may object to the indiscriminate use of the term feudal in relation to the society of Mughal India, which did not have hereditary fiefs, commendations, manors or serfdom, as a class the Mughal titled nobility still shared with the traditional hereditary aristocracy the political power to extract the surplus from agriculture. In other words, these jagirdars and mansabdars were state officials whose mode of payment and relationship to the state conferred on them the character and functions of an aristocracy, a fact spectacularly reflected in their lifestyle, except that they remained predominantly urban. They are somewhat comparable to the French aristocracy, who over the same period also moved from their rural castles into their urban hotels, and who also became ever more dependent on the king, till the point where they had become mere titled officials. In a conversation with the ambassador of England's James II, Sir Thomas Roe, Mir Jamal Uddin Hussain, Viceroy of Patan in Bengal, gave some illuminating details on the pay and the allowance of a high official in the Mughal government. Jamal Uddin held the rank of 5,000 horses, but was allowed to maintain 1,500 only at an annual cost of 200 rupees a head per trooper. But he drew the pay for the whole number. That was a net yearly gain of 700,000 rupees. He paid into the treasury 1,100,000 rupees annually for his province, it being understood that he could retain any surplus he was able to raise over and above the fixed revenue. Jamaluddin added that some governors had twice his income and more than 20 drew an equal amount. It may be added to this that the pay which Sir Thomas Roe received as an ambassador at the Mughal court was 600 sterling a year, equivalent at the rate of exchange of the day to just under 5,540 rupees. Or again, by way of further comparison, the average wage of a manual worker in Accra at the time was 48 rupees a year. A common foot soldier received 72 rupees, a linguist or clerk who needed a considerable degree of schooling, and the same group to whom Nana belonged, got 420 rupees, and the director of the Dutch East India Company at Surat received 3,000 rupees. Francisco Pelsar. Chief of the Dutch factory at Accra, a highly competent observer who stayed 7 years in the country, contrasted the luxurious life of the nobles with the miserable existence of the commoners. He wrote, "There are 3 classes of the people who are indeed nominally free, but whose status differs very little from voluntary slavery: workmen, peasants or servants, and shopkeepers. For the workmen there are 2 scourges, the first of which is low wages. Goldsmiths, painters, embroiderers, carpet makers, cotton or silk weavers, blacksmiths, coppersmiths, tailors, masons, builders, stone cutters, 100 crafts in all. For a job which 1 man would do in Holland, here passes through 4 men's hands before it is finished. Any of these, by working from morning to night, can earn only 5 or 6 takas, that is 4 or 5 stivers in wages. The second scourge is the oppression of the governor, the nobles, the divan, the kotwal, and other royal officers. If any of these want a workman, the man is not asked if he is willing to come, but he is seized in his house or on the street, and beaten if he should dare to raise an objection, and in the evening he is paid half his wages or nothing at all. From these facts, the nature of their food can be easily inferred. They know little of the taste of meat. For their monotonous daily food, they have nothing but a little khichdi made of green pulse mixed with rice, which is cooked with water over a little fire until the moisture has evaporated, and eaten hot with butter in the evening. In the daytime they munch a little parched pulse or other grain, which they say suffices for their lean stomachs." And Pelsar further pursued, "Their houses are built of mud with thatched roofs. Furniture there is little or none, except some earthenware pots to hold water and for cooking, and 2 beds, one for the man, the other for his wife. For here man and wife do not sleep together, but the man calls his wife when he wants her in the night, and when he has finished she goes back to her own place or bed. Their bedclothes are scanty, merely a sheet, or perhaps 2, serving both as under and oversheet. This is sufficient in the hot weather, but the bitter cold nights are miserable indeed, and they try to keep warm over little cow dung fires which are lit outside the door, because the houses have no fireplaces or chimneys. The smoke from these fires all over the city is so great that the eyes run and the throat seems to be choked." I should immediately observe on these observations that this description could have applied verbatim to the lot of the worker and peasant 200 years on, and often 300 years on, which simple fact by itself speaks volumes. And note, by the way, too, that Delhi's awful air pollution is clearly not a new problem too. Part of the vast incomes of the upper 10 went into hoarding, since they were afraid the emperor might seize their possessions at their death. But the bulk of it provided a market for luxuries and to allow a vast sway of retainers of the nobles. There was a considerable consumption of imported items, such as Persian carpets, wine, porcelain, and glass. For Persia was the clear fulcrum of luxury production for all the Persian speakers or heavily Persia-influenced countries, and those extended from the Ottoman Empire to Uzbekistan and from Bijapur to Java. The nobles' lavish lifestyle, however, still implied a very large demand for domestic manufactures. Bernier, much as Pelsar, suggested that the grandees freely exploited the artisan, paying him half his wages or nothing at all at the cudgel and the whip, and by the force of the long and terrible Korah which hung at every emir's door. The emirs, mostly military men as they were surely used to coerce lowly artisans and treat them with contempt. But the Korah and the cudgel still cannot explain how such places as Lahore and Agra blossomed into vast commercial emporia once the court established itself there, attracting goods, traders and artisans. You cannot desire anything, but you shall find it in this city, the English traveller Jourdain wrote of Agra. And the Italian adventurer and frankly speaking charlatan, posing at times as a doctor, at times as a military engineer, at times as a priest, without being blessed with any of those skills, except the lively imagination and a big sense of himself, who tried to gain fame and fortune at the Mughal court, Niccolo Manucci, described Delhi as a place where everything found a ready sale and where everything was consumed. The road from Agra to Fatehpur Sikri was like one continuous fancy fair. No pressure was needed to induce the supplies to follow the army on the march too, as we saw already, although the system very often malfunctioned. But commonly everything was almost as readily available in the imperial camp as in the imperial capital, though everything there was far more expensive, and that clearly attracted merchants and bankers in turn. Apart from its small circuit of international trade, late classic India, 6th to 10th century, was only a market economy to a very limited extent. Few products were bartered, and most of these were delivered at fixed prices to princes and temples. And the Delhi Sultanate, that often used administratively fixed prices, was evolved only halfway towards a market economy. But in the Mughal Empire, prices were fixed by supply and demand, and in the market, including for deliveries to the court, except, to be sure, for products made by the workshops attached to the court. We saw that with the land revenue system already, in which the rate of taxation of the products of the land was rated by the market prices. And all the grandees sought to emulate the imperial household's conspicuous consumption. Bernier, used to Parisian fashion and Parisian high life, was still impressed by the Mughals' lifestyle, with the, quote, consumption of fine cloth of gold and brocades, silks, embroideries, pearls, musk, amber and sweet essences. All these were procurable, and the royal bazaar accompanying the camp furnished fine cloth, jewelry, decorations of velvet and brocade for the palaces as much as for the camps, carpets, bedsteads, mirrors, gold and silver services, perfumes, wine cups, and in the 17th century coffee cups, equipment for horses and elephants, including picket chains of beaten gold, magnificently decorated palanquins, and weapons, which were often works of art, wrought with jewels and precious metals, and water pipes in the 17th century. All such were the major items on which royalty and the grandees expended their lavish incomes. 1,000 suits were made for Akbar every year. Abul Fazl had his entire wardrobe replaced annually, all the old clothes being distributed among his servants. The Lat estimated the daily outlay at Agra at 50,000 rupees for the emperor's food and clothing and the cost of feeding his elephants and so on, and another rupees 30,000 for the harem. And he wrote, with the possible exception of jewelry for the harem, more money was spent on the stables than on any other branch of a courtier's household. End quote. One courtier with sensitive nostrils had his horse daily rubbed with rose water that was imported from Persia at huge costs. As to the scale of the demand on this score, Shah Jahan kept at Delhi and Agra 200,000 to 300,000 horses, 8,000 to 9,000 elephants, besides a very large number of Baka's horses and mules. A courtier of Manucci's acquaintance spent 250,000 rupees a year on his menagerie. The number of slaves and servants in the employ of the nobility was truly staggering too. Each noble had at least 3 or 4 wives, and some had hundreds, and each of them had her own slaves, 10, 20 or 100, according to her status and fortune. Indeed, though the slave trade within India and between India and Central Asia had much declined from its height in the 13th century, occasional Mughal reprisals on communities not paying their revenue, and the poor selling children when they were in the utmost destitution, still brought a steady supply of slaves to the market, and the upper echelons of Mughal society were a slaveholder society, and in years that featured particular distress, such as the famine years of the 1630s, Indian slaves were even sold in Persia. Besides slaves, a noble's standard requirement, as indicated by Abul Fazl, included 4 men for each elephant, 2 or 3 per horse, a crowd of people for the kitchen, 2 crowds of 10 pitchers, and so on. A large retinue always accompanied the nobles whenever they went outdoor, wrote Pelsar, not only to clear the way, but to flap the flies away and brush off the dust with tails of peacocks, to carry the spittoon and the pioquedant. All the available evidence suggests that the inter-regional flow of commodities, both by land and along the coast, increased substantially during the Mughal period, and that this meant a corresponding expansion in the demand for manufactured goods. Mughal peace, increased urbanization, and to some extent the safeguarding of the coastal waters by the Portuguese navy, of which the benefits to the coastal traders outweighed the extra costs of obtaining Portuguese passports, all contributed to this process. Of particular importance was the widened market for intermediate products for manufacture, like yarn, cold thread, raw silk or metalwork, and chalk and cordage for ships, and packing materials like jute sacks and cordage. Among the staples of the coastal trade were food products like butter, oil and sugar, whereas rice was imported in quantity in Gujarat and the Deccan from Karnataka and from the rich core lands of Vijayanagar in particular, and rice was exported from Bengal too, while Sindh was a major exporter of grain to both Gujarat and the Persian Gulf. There was luxury manufacturing too. Lahore was renowned for her boots and shoes, harness and saddlery. Multan was renowned for leatherwork. The perfumes in which the Mughal nobility delighted came from far-flung parts of the empire and were imported from Persia and Arabia. Patna contributed the oddest item, perfumed pottery. The long lists of items of dress, harness for different animals in the royal stables, and the great variety of weapons, and the trend towards specialization in manufactures suggest that the number of separate manufacturing activities in the Mughal period was much larger than the 100 trades Pelsar mentioned. Since the affluent upper middle classes, the religious scholars, and often the wealthy traders and bankers of Delhi and Agra, though less so the ones in Gujarat who stuck to a more ascetic lifestyle, sought to emulate the ways of the Mughal nobility, there was a considerable output of such luxury manufactures. Mughal India, in short, had a manufacturing sector marked by great variety, vigor, and a huge volume of aggregate output, which mainly worked for the international market, but in the 17th century flooded European markets as well, as we shall see in a later episode. As no Mughal census has come down to us, the population of the Mughal Empire is anybody's guess. Most scholars, however, would still subscribe to the old estimates of William Morland that the empire contained about 30 million people in Bengal, which is a reasonable certain figure obtained by extrapolating figures from the 18th century, 40 million in Hindustan and the Punjab, under 10 million in Rajasthan and central India. These are two cases of guesswork. 6 million in Gujarat, again a reasonable certain figure, and to that should be added 20 million for the whole of the Deccan, 4 million in Kerala, and roughly 14 million for the rest of the south. We end up with a total Indian population of 120 million in the late 17th century, a figure which likely had increased since the 16th century, and a figure that is roughly comparable with the population of contemporary Europe. The rate of urbanization was clearly very different. At one extreme was Gujarat, where up to 1/4 of the population lived in cities, and on the other extreme were places like practically entirely rural Rajasthan. Besides of which there were places like Bengal, where there were few large cities, but along the banks of the Hooghly stretched a sheer uninterrupted ribbon of large villages. Nevertheless, it has been estimated that the rural population must then have comprised something like 85% of the total population, a percentage that India would incidentally not achieve again until her independence from Britain. Even counting in that the travellers, on whom we have to entirely depend for the size of cities, tend to far overrate the populations of urban centres, it is still not too far-fetched to think that Delhi and Lahore, with 1 million inhabitants, were among the largest cities in the world. The figure for Lahore, given by the generally very reliable Pedro Barreto de Resende, who considered Lahore the largest city in Asia. It is also reasonable to estimate that Agra and Ahmedabad surpassed the 500,000, as did Hyderabad and perhaps Bijapur outside of Mughal territory, and that the port city of Cambay surpassed the 100,000, as did Kazim Bazar in Bengal and Berhampur. The 17th century then witnessed a relative decline of Lahore and Cambay, but saw the rise of Surat, which towards its end had about 300,000 inhabitants, and of Dhaka, which by the late 17th century had become the great central mart of Bengal and one of the world's greatest emporia. But despite all those teeming cities, Mughal India still had the appearance of a vast countryside cultivated by myriads of peasants, each with his own separate field. Laying lists of villages in the Mughal period next to their modern names, the villages in the Mughal period were likely smaller than those of today, but the numbers of villages were comparable, famously more than 500,000 of them now and then. Population since then would seem to have grown not by multiplying the number of settlements, but by enlarging and even merging existing ones. In all essentials, the agricultural practices of the Indian peasants were similar to the ones pursued by their counterparts in Europe, given the differences in crops and climate. As an English visitor noted, they tilled the land and dressed the corn with no remarkable difference from other nations. The wooden ploughs they used were similar to the foot ploughs used at the time in England, and if there was in the ploughshare only a little iron tooth or none at all, it was because the lighter soil in India did not need the heavy iron coulter needed to plough the rain-sodden soils of England. The most common way of irrigation was the chara, in which water was lifted in a leather bucket attached to a rope drawn over a pulley wheel by a yoke of oxen or people. The most sophisticated device was the Persian wheel, one of the most important technological innovations, together with paper and the new form of a handloom, that the Delhi Sultanate had brought to India. In Babur's description, quote, "In Lahore, Dibalpur and those parts," that is the modern part of the Punjab in Pakistan, "people water by means of a wheel. They make 2 circles of ropes, long enough to suit the depth of the well, fixed strips of wood between them, and on these fastened pitchers. The rope with the wood and attached pitchers are put over the well wheel. At one end of the wheel axle a second wheel is fixed, and close to it another on an upright axle. This last wheel the bullock turns. Its teeth catch in the teeth of the second, and thus the wheel with the pitcher is turned." End quote. The Persian wheel was made of wood and earthen pot, and worked on a combination of pin drum gearing and belt, the gear wheel being rotated by draught animals going round in circles. Tanks or reservoirs had traditionally played an important role as sources of irrigation in central India, the Deccan and southern India. Archaeological remains attest to the massiveness of dams and to the ingenious arrangements of sluices for letting out water. In Mewar, the Debar Lake, 36 miles in circumference, is mentioned in the Ain-i-Akbari, which says it supported wheat cultivation in the country around it. The dam which held its vast waters was rebuilt or reinforced in 1691. Udaiskat, 12 miles in circumference, was created by a dam built in 1565. Another large lake, the Rajsakar, was similarly constructed in Mewat in the 17th century. Such works were also built by the rulers of Navarre. In the northern plains, particularly Upper Gangetic and Indus basins, numerous canals were cut from rivers to furnish irrigation works. Some were impressive works by any standard. Shah Jahan's Nagar-i-Faiz was over 150 miles in length, taking off from the Jamuna at the point where it relieves the hills and then, first southwest and then southeast, joins the parent river at Delhi. Another canal, less than 100 miles long, similarly took off from the Ravi River to rejoin it at Lahore. Traces of other canals, dating from both the Mughal period as from the Sultanate times, are found all over the Indus plains down to the delta. Not only did the Indian peasant grow a multiplicity of crops, but he was also prepared to accept new crops. The 17th century saw the introduction and the expansion of two major new crops, tobacco and maize. Both were immigrants from the New World, and both were first grown by the Portuguese in India. The rapid extension of tobacco was spectacular. Its cultivation had begun on the western coast soon after 1600, but by 1650 it was being cultivated throughout the Mughal Empire and in southern India, and by 1700 even rural laborers on the Indian west coast would not drag things without first having had a smoke, while clearly the water pipe had by then become central to India's polite society. There were attempts under Jahangir, inspired by the anger of the ulama on this newfangled and dirty habit, to outlaw smoking, but these prohibitions were soon forgotten or ignored again. And completely contrary to the ingrained image of the Indian peasants as forever locked up in the stultifying world of their small villages, peasant populations were in the Mughal period often quite mobile. Indeed, abundant research shows that the image of an immobile rural population is largely a colonial mirage. It was noted by Babar, quote, "In Hindustan, hamlets and villages, even towns, are depopulated and set up in a moment. If a people of a large town who had lived there for years flee from it, they do it in such a way that not a sign or trace of them remains in a day or a day and a half. On the other hand, if they fix their eyes on a place in which to settle, they need not dig watercourses or construct dams," end quote, as they would have to do in Central Asia. This was, of course, only possible because there was still plenty of virgin land available during the 16th and 17th century, although the population was considerably denser in the 17th century than it had been in the 13th, when there were, as we observed earlier, still dense forests immediately next to Delhi, and in the Punjab, which had largely disappeared by the 17th century. It merits notice too that contrary to the hoary theory of Oriental despotism, to which the peasants were supposedly condemned because the irrigation systems pinned the peasants in one place, the observations of Babar actually relate to the dry zone of India, where, as he noted, the peasants needed to build elaborate waterworks if they wanted to move. Most of those were small-scale works that were built by the villagers themselves, however. Though, as we saw before, the Mughal Tanadars were prescribed to allot them every kind of help if they expanded the agrarian acreage. The information on the yield of the crops is limited. However, it seems certain that between 1540 and 1870 there was practically no change in the yield per unit per acre in the case of food grains. And this for the obvious reason that the techniques and methods used by cultivators in 1870 were the same as they had been 300 years before. This was partly because with the repeated famines, in case the monsoon failed, or scarcities, the peasants had learned that any gamble with different techniques of cultivation could mean starvation. However, it was also because of all the supposed efforts of the British Raj to improve productivity. And it is very likely, moreover, that productivity per head of agricultural unit was higher in 1593 than it was around 1870 or 1900. Given the greater availability of land, with the means and the methods of cultivation remaining the same, the average peasant holding of 1595 was more likely to approach the optimum size than the one of 1900. The peasant of Mughal times had probably a larger stock of cattle too, and thus the ability to plough up a larger area of land than his successor around 1900 had. Thus Abul Fazl puts the number of cattle allowed tax-free for each plough at 4 bullocks, 2 cows and 1 buffalo, whereas the average number of cattle per yoke in Uttar Pradesh in 1924 was 2 bullocks, 1 cow and 1 buffalo. In other words, the living standard of a peasant in Uttar Pradesh was lower than it was 400 years earlier. Comparing salaries mentioned by Abul Fazl with prices of foodstuffs in Agra in 1590 and doing a similar exercise with prices and wages in 1930, it can be calculated that a peasant could buy 40% less goods than his distant ancestor could do 400 years earlier. However, in speaking of average yields per cultivator and about living standards, we should not overlook that the Indian peasantry was economically highly stratified, and that considerable differences existed in the size of holdings, the products obtained, and the resources of the peasants within the same village. On the one hand, there were the big peasants, or the headmen, the Muqaddams, who, as one Mughal document says, organized the good caste cultivation under their own management. They employ laborers as their servants and put them to the tasks of agriculture, and making them plough, sow, reap, and draw water out of the well, they pay them their fixed wages, whether in cash or in grain, while appropriating to themselves the gross produce of cultivation. At the opposite end were the small peasants, who, as a farman issued by Aurangzeb described them, engaged in cultivation, but depended, quote, wholly upon borrowing for their subsistence and for seeds and cattle. End quote. Then, much as later, the peasantry was heavily in debt to moneylenders, debts which might reach such proportions that at times of scarcity or famine, the peasants, just to get out of their debts, had to sell their children as slaves, or bonded laborers, as people call them now. The cluster of huts forming an Indian village was in Akbar's time much as what it had been in those of the Buddha. It was a self-contained community. Originally, the headman was nominated by the king, Later that office became hereditary. The village was governed by its headman with his satellites, the accountant and the watchman, who were usually hereditary office holders as well. The accountant kept the records of the villagers' land rights and the individual accounts due for the levy of the land revenue. He also reported upon the crops. The village watchman, or the chowkidar, has been the real foundation of law and order in rural India since Indian history began. A village had its local priest, a religious mendicant, and in all except the smallest hamlets, the carpenter and the smith, the weaver, the potter and the oil presser carried on their trade, much as their forebears did 2000 years ago. Every village had its panchayat, which decided civil and minor criminal cases. There were as many caste panchayats in each village as there were castes inhabiting the villages. The members of the panchayats were elected by the people, and the panjas or judges were those who had rendered some conspicuous service to their caste or to the entire village community. The decisions of the panchayats were almost invariably unanimous and were not so much aimed at finding a culprit as in the accusational system of justice that is used in Europe, as reaching a settlement between the parties where the question of guilt is more or less left in the middle. Punishments inflicted were fines, public degradation or reprimands, or excommunication from the caste in very severe cases. No sentences of imprisonment or death were allowed, because there was no proper authority to execute those sentences and because there were no jails in the villages. These kinds of cases had to be deferred to the Mughal Kotwal instead. The prestige enjoyed by the panchayats was great, but their authority was moral rather than political or administrative. The fear of public opinion was one of the most potent factors responsible for the prevention of crime, and hardly did any case reach outside the boundaries of a village. Normally, cases involving even murder were settled locally. The law administered by the panchayats was usually the caste or tribal usage and the customary law of the land. As Mount Stuart Elphinstone said in 1821, quote, "Those communities contain in miniature all the materials of a state within themselves and are almost sufficient to protect their members if all other governments were withdrawn. Though probably not compatible with a very good form of government, they are an excellent remedy for the imperfections of a bad one. They prevent the bad effects of its negligence and weakness, and even present some barrier against its tyranny and rapacity." In the next episode we will be considering Mughal art.